The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize through to mind the Tathagata. And the Tathagata is the name that is used to represent the Buddha. And of course, every one of us has got this Buddha seed. We're all Buddha. Buddha's hibernating, I guess maybe is a good way to put it. We are endowed with all we need to come to profound awakening, whatever we term it. And it is entirely possible. And I think we have a slight advantage here in the Rinzai Zen system in that we have tools that are known to be effective in that. So keep going is the most important message I can give everybody. Keep going, be as clear as possible, and really sink into the whatever you call it, the sense that brings you to practice, the sense that brings you to question the status quo, the assumptions that people generally have about life, about themselves, about living, and so on. All of us who are here have this deep sense that there's something more, something just beyond the veil, something we can reconnect to. And it's an accurate sense. And as we put it deeply into our practice, that felt sense, that yearning, whatever you want to call it, along with this most effective extended out-breath practice, we will get there. We will close that gap. We will comprehend what we have lost contact with, but we are getting closer and closer and closer. There's no question about it. Yesterday, in yesterday's teisho, which is not yet on YouTube, I spoke of the sort of a reality check of Zen practice. And in a nutshell, there is an assumption, or has been an assumption, a widespread assumption, that when we entertain ourselves with Zen practice, and entertain might be the active word, but when we engage in Zen practice, seriously, if we have anything that we've buried in our psyche from early childhood experiences, from situations that create anxiety in us, every attempt to keep that stuffed is going to interfere with your Zen practice. But the amazing thing about Zen practice, as was pointed out decades ago by a friend of mine who was at the Rochester Zen Center when I was, who had a kensho in a sesshin where she wrote that she felt she had to virtually nail herself to the mat. She just wanted to flee. And that was a very familiar feeling to me in my earlier years of practice as well. And for good reason. There were things that I had stuffed in my experience in order simply to function, simply to survive. But if we are to be free of all of that, truly free, it's important to work with it in appropriate ways. Those appropriate ways might actually even include therapy. And here you've got to be careful about who you do therapy with, because there are some that are effective and there are some that aren't. There are some that support doing meditation practice. There are some that are suspicious of it. And so if you're looking to do any kind of therapy, and it can help tremendously in clearing the decks so we can practice more deeply, then you want to be careful who you connect with in that field. But today, I wanted to mention Hakuin, who also went through it. Hakuin was a very, very sensitive boy when he was young. He was the I think he was the youngest kid in his family. He had some sisters and at least one older brother. And his parents ran an inn on what's known as the Tokaido, the great road between the capital and other major cities. And at the time, the governing bodies of each of the provinces, the daimyo, were required to come to the capital twice a year at great expense. And I think this was calculated to keep them from uprising. And they traveled along this road. It ran along fairly close to the sea, actually. And so his parents had an inn, and they ran an inn on this road. And every year, twice a year, these amazing entourages, replete with jugglers and musicians and all kinds of entertainment, would come along with the daimyo at the head of the thing. And then they would return, and then they'd come back again 6 months later, and then return again 6 months later. So he was able to see all manner of people. It was quite entertaining. But beyond that, young Hakuin was a very sensitive kid. His mom was very into a type of Buddhism. It wasn't Zen, but she would take him to lectures when he was quite young. And these lectures were terrifying to him. I don't know much about them. I do know there's a strain of Buddhism, particularly in China, that's pretty dogmatic. And if you ever get to Southeast Asia, Singapore, Rangoon, and Hong Kong all have what are known as tiger balm gardens, because they were established through funding from the man who invented tiger balm. And tiger balm is an ointment that is used all over Asia, almost universally, for all kinds of things. Any ache or pain, you pull out the tiger balm. And it can be effective. It's sold in the United States as well, and I think all over the world, actually, at this point. And these gardens featured life-size, three-quarter size, quarter-size images of what are assumed to be the Buddhist hells. The hell, the freezing cold hell, the hot hell, the boiling in oil hell, the being skewered by swords hell. I mean, every imaginable awful thing that can happen to somebody is depicted in these places. I've been to the one in Singapore, and I've been to the one in Hong Kong. Didn't realize when I lived in Rangoon, Yangon, that there was one there. But there was, I believe, a Burmese man that invented tiger balm, but I could be wrong. With this in mind, there's an important thing I have to say about this, because although these depictions of hell are graphic, the only real hell is in your own mind. Yes, people can be punished, people can be traumatized, but most of the time, heaven and hell are within our own minds. An example of this, a samurai went to a eminent Zen master centuries ago and said, what is heaven and what is hell? And the Zen master said, oh, you idiot. What makes you think you're smart enough to understand that? And of course, the samurai went into a rage, lifted his sword, and the master said, that's hell. And the samurai got it and lowered his sword, dropped his shoulders, relaxed. And the master said, and that's heaven. The challenge is, how do we bring ourselves into heaven, and how do we keep ourselves out of hell, as inner as they are? And when young Hakuin was taken to these lectures by his mom, he came back terrified. In fact, one in particular, when he was 10 or 11 years old, in Japan, even today, people have a Japanese bath in their homes, and it is a big tub of hot water. The water is heated specifically for the bath. Nowadays, you turn on the faucet, but in the old days, they put a fire under it. And you bathe ahead of time, because it's really a soaking tub. And then you get in. And this one particular time after this lecture, the maid had got the fire too hot, and the water in the tub actually started bubbling. And Hakuin was terrified. He thought this was the bubbling hell realm. And he refused to get in, and he cried and begged his mother to tell him how he could avoid falling into hell. This is also a young boy who did boy things. He had a slingshot, and he and his little buddies would go and take pot shots at the crows and killed some. And he was sensitive enough that he began to feel remorse for that. Then another thing he did, he had a little bow and arrow set. And Japanese traditional houses have walls of paper, literally paper. They're paper on a wooden frame. And they slide so you can change the shape of your rooms as well. And his older brother had managed to save enough money to buy a scroll that was very precious to him. And little Hakuin was playing inside the house, probably told he shouldn't be, but he was playing inside his house, shooting his little bow and arrow. And he managed to shoot right through the wall, right through the skull, right through the eye of the person in the painting of his brother's scroll. So another example of that. But being as sensitive as he was as well, he was quite concerned about falling into hell. Somehow he became familiar with the Kannon Sutra. Kannon, of course, is the Bodhisattva of compassion. And the Kannon Sutra is very, very quite graphic about how people are rescued from terrible, terrible situations. If you're in a drowning sea, you call on Kanzeon, Kannon, and she'll rescue you, and so on and so forth. There's an English translation of this sutra that my Dharma sister Mitra-roshi, who teaches at the Vermont Zen Center and also at Casa Zen in Costa Rica, and who has a Dharma successor in the Toronto Zen Center, they chant that daily at their center. It's quite a challenging thing to chant. It's syncopated, and there's ups and downs and so on, and you sort of have to learn how to chant it. But if you're interested, we used to have a copy of it, and we can track down one for you if you want. At any rate, so young Hakuin felt that Kannon would rescue him. And so he went up in the hill behind his house, and he found actually a big rock that seemed to appear to be like a figure of Kannon. And he would sit there and he would try to meditate. I don't think he was ever instructed in how to do it, but he would try to meditate. And he would chant and chant and chant. Prior to that, however, he had begged his mother to tell him how he could escape hell. And his mother said, "Oh, quit fussing. I'll tell you in the morning." And so in the morning, he said to her, "Tell me, tell me, tell me. You've got to tell me. How can I escape hell?" And so she pulled something out of the woodwork and said, "You were born on the day honoring the Shinto shrine. I don't remember what his name was. The god of the Shinto shrine. And so if you venerate him, if you chant to him, you will be saved. He will save you." So that started an earnest practice of chanting to Tenjin, I think was the name of the god, the Shinto god. And he was doing that for many months. And then he thought, wonder if this is really working. Let's put it to the test. And he lit a stick of incense, put it in the incense pot, and said, "If this incense smoke rises straight up, it means that I'm on the right track." So he closed his eyes and waited. Then he opened them, and it was going straight up. And then a waft of air came and disturbed it and sank his heart. So he no longer had trust in the ability of Tenjin to save him. So that's when he went and started working with Kanon. And interestingly enough, many, many years later, he had a Kensho experience, a very deep Kensho experience, in which there was he found a mirror. He had a dream that he found a mirror in his robe sleeve, and he pulled it out, and it was and looked at it, and there was the face of Kanon. So many of his paintings over the rest of his life, once he started doing paintings, were of his own face, but as Kanon. At a certain point, his mother took him to another lecture. I think this was actually a play. Apparently, there was historically a Buddhist monk who was condemned to being tortured by having a red-hot iron kettle placed on his head. And this was depicted in this play, and the man just stood quietly as this red-hot kettle was placed on his head. I mean, this big bowl covered his head, and it was red hot. It had been heated to that temperature, and he just was quiet and okay with it. And so Hakuin said, "Aha, there's my way out of hell. I will become a Buddhist monk." And so he begged his parents to let him become a Buddhist monk. And they refused for a year, and then they finally relented. So when he was 13 or 14, depending on whether it's the Asian calendar or the Western calendar you look at, he was ordained as a Buddhist monk. And he thought, finally, okay, now I got a chance. And his first training, it was not in Zen, it was in reciting sutras. So he learned how to recite the sutras. And then he spent a few years doing that, and then was traveling a bit and heard a lecture in which it was spoken of the experience of Ganto. Ganto was a Chinese monk, very highly regarded Chinese monk, who had a deep awakening experience relatively early. And one day when he was, I think, 53 years old, it was a time of great unrest in China, and bandits came and theoretically, I think, probably to rob the temple. And it's unknown what his response was, except that he got murdered as a result. He was skewered with a sword. That's one version. Another version is his head was cut off, but I don't think that was the accurate one, because supposedly, as he was being skewered, he let out a yell, so loud that it was heard 3 miles away. And suddenly, Hakuin's heart sank once more. How could a monk so deeply realized, so long a monk, die screaming? And it just took all the oomph out of his practice. And as a matter of fact, he quit practice for a while and apprenticed himself. He was, I think, 19 or 20 years old when this happened. Apprenticed himself to a master calligrapher. He was with the master calligrapher less than a year, and when he realized that he was never going to make it as a calligrapher, which is ironic because he was prolific in that art throughout the rest of his life. In fact, it's estimated the number of calligraphies attested to him are so many that he would have to have done something like 500 a day. And of course, he was giving them to his students for inspiration. And but many of them are still extant. They cost a pretty penny, but you can buy original Hakuin scrolls. He had an amazing range of style, and he was a good artist as well. And of course, there were so many depictions of Kanon with his face, and he had a very interesting kind of face, almost as if he had a hooked nose. You can see the pictures probably on the web. I'm sure that there are a number that are featured. And at any rate, he abandoned the calligraphy training and was wandering around, not really sure what to do next. And he happened in a temple where they were airing the scrolls. The climate in Japan is so damp that it's traditional every year when there's a warm, sunny day to bring all the scrolls out of storage and open them up and air them out. Otherwise, they're going to get moldy. And also, there's the challenge of silverfish eating the scrolls too. You can find old scrolls that are stained with mildew and have little holes in them where bugs have eaten them. And we did this at Songenji as well. Every year, spring and fall, we would have a day where these scrolls were spread out and aired, and then they were rolled up again with a kind of a powder put in them that discouraged the insects. And so it was one of these days that Hakuin encountered this event at a temple, and he thought, I'm going to just close my eyes and put my finger on a scroll, and that will tell me what I am to do next. And so that's what he did. Closed his eyes, planted his finger, opened his eyes, and it happened to be right on the tail of a Chinese monk who was so dedicated to practice that he actually kept an awl. I don't know if you know what an awl is, but it's the original drill, basically. It's a very sharp pointed instrument, handheld, and he would hold it at his thigh. And as he was beginning to fall asleep, he would stab himself in the thigh. And he had a deep awakening experience. And this so inspired Hakuin that he went back to Zen practice. He was a very dynamic human being. There's a life-size portrait of him in, it's a sculpture of him at the temple he founded. He didn't found It actually was an old family temple that he ended up running, and it is in the little village that he lived in, and it is very, very dynamic. He's like leaning forward with this dynamic expression on his face, and as if to say, "Now, do it, do it, do it." And that figure actually sits behind the altar table on a few steps. And in Japan, steps are quite tall. They're maybe 10 inches, 12 inches tall, above the zendo. So rather than a regular traditional altar where Manjusri would be on the altar, the bodhisattva of wisdom with his delusion-cutting sword, instead you have Hakuin overlooking the whole zendo. It's a quite powerful place. It's not a teaching zendo anymore. I don't know whatever happened to his any successors at that particular place. However, he was such a dynamic teacher that every single Rinzai lineage in Japan now runs through him. There had been several, but the others all died out. He struggled with practice and actually made himself sick with this intense striving, which has come down to us in some Japanese Zen. The Yasutani line, there's a sense of striving attached to it. But when I went to Sogenji, there was a dynamic practice, and there was urging to go deep, but it wasn't a striving type of practice, which is interesting. You can go deep in your Zen practice without, as Hakuin once said, digging your fingernails into your palms and striving. And he did do that for some years and actually managed to get sick. He got a kensho out of it, but he managed to get sick at a certain point because it just wasn't something his body could physically maintain. That first kensho of his was so dramatic for him. It was, he heard a bell sound. He was at a visiting, he was visiting a lecture series, and this is how Zen training was taken in those days. This is the 18th century in Japan. People didn't generally live at temples, but they went in groups to various temples where the masters were giving lectures on particular sutras or whatever. And it was at one of those trainings, the three-week training, I think, that he decided to just go and sit. He found a place where nobody was around, a little hut or something on the property, and just sat and determined that he was going to break through. And the big bell, and in Japan, these big bells are quite big. And the one at Sogenji was rather small. It was only about 4 feet tall, but they come 8, 10, 12 feet tall, huge, that have to be struck with logs. It's a wonderful, deep sound these bells have. But the bell sounded, and it triggered an awakening experience for him. But he was so full of himself that he assumed that he had had the most amazing, deep kensho experience that anybody had ever had in 300 years. And it really went to his head. But at that same lecture meeting, there was another monk who struck Hakuin as being rather advanced and very quiet and very perceptive. And so he talked to this guy and said, who's your master? Let's leave the meeting early and take me to meet your master. So the man did, And thus it was that Hakuin traveled to a different part of Japan and met Dokyo Eitan, who is also known as the old man of Shoju Hermitage. Dokyo Eitan didn't really have any students other than the one that went to the lecture meeting. He was such a rough and aggressive human being that monks couldn't take it very long, and so they usually ran away, except for this one. So Hakuin went, and Dokyo Eitan brought him down several pegs. He assigned him a koan, and Hakuin would bring his answer, and Dokyo Eitan would say, "You rice bag," and not accept the answer. And at one time, he even pushed Hakuin off this very narrow little deck that ran on one side of the building. Dokyo Eitan did not live in a big temple by any means. He lived in basically a hermitage. It was essentially one room where you ate, slept, cooked, and all the rest. And along the one side of it, there was this maybe 14-inch wide little low deck. It was only about a foot off the ground. It's very unlike the normal engawas, they call them, around Japanese temples, which are more like 3 feet above the ground. Japan is a very wet place, and it rains a lot, and so it's helpful to have the buildings raised and to have a raised little deck to be on if you wanted to go out in the rare sunshine. And so Dokyo Eitan at one point even just shoved him off this little mini deck and into the mud. But the other thing about Dokyo Eitan's temple is he was intensely poor, and so anybody training with him had to go supply themselves with food. So at one point, Hakuin was in the village and going on what's known as takohatsu, which is wrongly translated as begging. It's seen as expressing the Dharma, sharing the Dharma, offering the teachings. And whenever some person makes a donation to you, you stand there with hands palm in palm, and you chant a sutra for their benefit. And so he was, the other thing is at the beginning of each point that you reach on your path, you stand before the building or the house, and you have hands palm to palm, and you chant Dharma, ho, and you just stand there, just chanting that, and wait till someone comes out and makes an offering. And if nobody makes an offering, then you leave. Well, he was so involved, so filled with the presence of his koan practice, that he didn't notice that the person in the house was trying to get rid of him, was not interested in contributing. And she finally, this old lady, when he didn't move on, she came out with a broom and whacked him over the head, and he fell unconscious into the mud. And it triggered a Kensho experience, another one. And so passersby came by, and one of them helped him up and said, that old lady really took out your lights, didn't she? And at which point Hakuin just howled in laughter. He was so free. And this is something that happens to people, not necessarily that you'll howl with laughter, but a definite, sincere, deep Kensho will bring you to tears because of the immense feeling of liberation. Suddenly, all your stuck places have dropped away. All your fears, all the challenges have dropped away and you're suddenly truly free. Now, a word of caution here, because it has to be a very deep kensho for that to happen to that degree. And the other thing is that it's a in some ways, the immediate result is relatively temporary. But fairly soon after, your old habit patterns will come rolling back in. And then the long maturation is important. You are able to see now where you're caught. And it's so much easier to let go. So in that sense, the kensho is real. And you have experienced a profound experience of freedom that gives you the faith that that is what you can realize permanently if you keep going. And it is so. I guarantee it is so. Hakuin stayed with him a few more months, but not long, because the group of other monks that he had been traveling with and had abandoned at that other training tracked him down. And Hakuin recognized that, first of all, there was no place for them to train with Dokyo Eitan. He simply had this tiny little hut, and if they camped out in the gardens, they'd wreck it. So he reluctantly felt that he needed to leave. Dokyo Eitan wanted him to stay. Dokyo Eitan walked with him and continued walking with him further and further until Hakuin finally said, no, you have to go back. And Hakuin never saw him again. He died some time later, I think, within a year, I think, later. But Hakuin is considered to be Dokyo Eitan's Dharma successor. He continued working on koans and would communicate with Dokyo Eitan's monk, who unfortunately also died young. So Hakuin is considered the sole successor for Dokyo Eitan, and got more koans and checked his answers through this other monk, and continued working the rest of his life. He had, by his own count, 19 major kensho experiences and countless minor ones. And that is a wonderful model to emulate. Here is somebody who was scared so much as a child, so anxious, and yet through the practice, through dedicated practice, was able to free himself completely from it. Little by little, kensho by kensho, and his final kensho was at the age of 53, I think. But the kensho, at one point he had a kensho where he realized, as he called out, oh, Ganto is alive and well right here now. That's something to ponder. Ganto, the Chinese master who was skewered by the bandits and died centuries ago in China, how could he be alive and well right now? Well, if you go deeply enough in your practice, it'll become clear to you. So we too can become like Hakuin. It means facing our stuff. And I mentioned that he had gotten sick, kind of a nervous energy sickness, almost a nervous breakdown kind of. And then he came up with this story, which he likely invented himself, about having gone to meet a 300-year-old mountain hermit. And there was this actual mountain hermit did live historically on the mountains outside of Kyoto 300 years prior. But supposedly this mountain hermit taught him a way to bring his energy down, to relax his shoulders, to really focus from his hara, his tanden. And this is why in Rinzai Zen, focusing on our hara, living from our hara, is so valued and so importantly taught. Because when we can be grounded, it's much easier to practice. We're not caught in as much anxiety. And this extended out breath is a master at helping us ground. You can read about what Hakuin used in, I think is it Orategama? There's it's a practice of imagining a lump of buttery, sweet-smelling elixir on the top of your head. Just imagine it. Focus your head, or focus your attention as if that was happening. And this warm, sweet-smelling elixir is beginning to melt. And it's melting all the way down over your face and over the sides of your head and the back of your head. It's embracing your shoulders and continuing to melt all the way down into your hara. And when you do that repeatedly, you find yourself increasingly grounded. You can read the details. I'm pretty sure they're somewhere on the web. But I share his story because it's so easy to relate to, even though he lived several centuries ago, because it shows us how somebody who could have been troubled as a kid, had painful experiences, and yet became probably the most leading Zen master, not probably, the most leading Zen master in the Rinzai system. And his teachings are still so profoundly alive today. You can read his autobiography. It's called Wild Ivy, translated by Norman Waddell, who's an excellent translator of Hakuin. And it's probably available on Amazon.com if anybody wants to search it out. It's a really interesting read. So now it's only 2 minutes till the end of the sitting. And I think we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. Thank you very much for listening.